I'm Alison Crowell. I'm the Associate Director of the CSDC, and it's my pleasure to welcome Eline de Rooij, Associate Professor at SFU, to our speaker series. This is the second to the last speaker series of the year, and she's going to be talking to us about political participation around immigration, and I'm really pleased to have her. To give you a little sense of her work, if you're not already familiar with it, she works largely on questions about how to mobilize various communities to participate in politics, both electorally and non-electorally, and has published broadly on the topic. And one of the things that you might know about her work is that she really mobilizes a lot of field experiments in the ways in which she studies these issues, which are becoming much more common in the field now, but Eline was really at the forefront of some of these methods, both in Canada and elsewhere. And so it's a real pleasure to introduce you here. We'll hand over the reins to you to do your presentation, and then I'll open it up for questions once you're done.
Thank you, Alison, for the very kind and flattering introduction. So I'm really excited to be here. Let me start sharing my screen. And I see many names I recognize and some I don't, so I'm very excited to share my work. So broadly speaking, this particular line of work that I'm going to be presenting today is driven by the question how immigrants, and those, by immigrants, I mean literally those people who've moved countries, so not second or third, but first generation immigrants, come to actually feel part of and engage in a political community, in a new political community. Now, in this talk, what I'll be doing is addressing two and highlighting two key debates as I see them in that literature. And they have relevance for both academic debates as well as kind of non-academic. So these debates obviously often spill over. The first debate I want to address by presenting some of the results of a paper of mine. This is a fairly long-standing paper, which I've been adding on to over time. And I'm quite excited to present it here because this actually is a non-experimental paper. So one of my very few non-experimental papers. So I'm very excited to kind of show that part of myself, because as Alison pointed out, I'm mainly an experimentalist. But this is a kind of a broader overview paper that kind of sets the fundament and the basis for some of the follow-up work I am doing and will be doing. So, so that paper I'll spend most of this presentation on. Then I'm already giving the plot line away here, but briefly go over a failed pilot study that we did to address the second debate and kind of tie in some of the future work in that area. So I'll close off then by talking about some takeaways and some of my future research. Now, the first debate I want to address, which is a fairly familiar one maybe for at least some of you, I see some names that have worked on this, is about how and when we form attitudes about politics and the political system and how we adopt certain participatory behaviors, and whether that is voting or whether we're talking about protesting or engaging in local community action. So on the one hand, we have this idea that political attitudes and behaviors are formed early in life and that they're fairly resistant to change. And that therefore, if individuals move countries, and in particular after their formative years, that there's little adaptation to a new political environment. Now, these ideas, of course, stem from kind of classic political socialization literature that's been recently revived. And in particular, this literature tends to stress, for instance, the type of political cultures immigrants come from, originate from, and or the types of regimes, whether it be democratic or non-democratic, that they have experienced whilst growing up. On the other hand, we have this idea of adaptations, that immigrants are essentially a blank slate upon arrival and that they adapt their political attitude and behavior purely, or at least mostly, in response to political experiences in their new country. And this literature tends to focus on differences in receiving countries or differences between receiving countries in terms of the supports provided by the state for immigrants and the extent to which immigrants are, for instance, welcomed by local populations, and related to that, the time spent in this new context. With citizenship seen as an important milestone for that idea of political incorporation. Now, White et al. And colleagues have tested these ideas about resistance and exposure as they call them. And I also suggested a third option, namely transferability, which makes very much sense if you think about it. And that's the idea that immigrants might build on pre-existing beliefs and habits in responding to new political experiences in their country. Now, some of the studies, and I just named two here, of course, from our Canadian colleagues, so I just wanted to highlight those. The few studies that have undertaken kind of tests of this country of origin and what I sometimes call country of destination or country of residence, and if these differences show some mixed results. And some, for instance, have placed some importance, stressed the importance of pre-migration experience, particular types of political regimes, such as Antoine Boludeau, who I think is with us today, and others stressing the importance of adaptation, for instance, White and colleagues, or at least from that transferability. Now, this debate is important because it touches on the ease of adaptability of new arrivals and of the limits of potential policies of receiving society. So hence it's an important debate. Now, that leads me to the question that I address in this paper that I'm presenting here, in which I do focus on Europe, mainly because of data restrictions, and ask how we can explain this variation in rates of direct political action across immigrants within Europe. So when I talk about variation, of course, that's often what we're interested in explaining, right? Why does something vary? Why does some outcome vary? And I'll distinguish in doing so between variation between immigrants based on where they come from, their countries of origins, as well as variation between immigrants based on their country of residence, where they live, and how that kind of varies across these shared contexts. Now, let me first explain what in this context I mean by immigrant, and that's in the context of this paper. So I use a very strict definition of what I mean by immigrant, because I really want to look at those people who have moved and have that experience of different contexts. So I'm talking about those who are born outside the country that they currently reside in, and who migrated 20 years ago or less. The 20 years is partly cut off from the way the question was asked in the data, but I think it's also a good indication of large enough length of time to go through that process of getting more and more comfortable with your own country, but still also allowing for that, having an experience potentially in another country. And then finally, I also add the requirement that both parents should be also born outside the country that the immigrant lives in. So we're talking about relatively recent immigrants. Now, the results I'm presenting today are this first stab at this as I already said, very broad look. And we're mainly talking about variations and explaining variations. And as an experimentalist, I try to be very careful and not talking about causes, although, of course, the theories often presume causes, as we know. So the data I look at is from the European Social Survey, which includes 32 countries of destination. So those are the countries in which people were surveyed, and 179 countries of origin. And it's the 7 rounds of the European Social Survey I used, the first 7, 2002 to 2015. So here just gives you a sense of the numbers of the immigrants in that data by country of residence. So for instance, you can see in Greece here, I have 515 immigrants who are currently living in Greece or currently at the time of the survey. And for instance, when we look at Sweden, just to pick another one, I have 555 immigrants who are currently living in Sweden. So the total number of immigrants in my data is over 10,000. So pretty good numbers. Now, here I show you the immigrants by country of origin. As I said, I have about 179 countries of origin. So these are just the countries of origin with immigrant groups larger than 90, just to give you a bit of an idea. And again, we see some variation. So for instance, I have 228 immigrants from Brazil here. And if we look at France, for instance, I have 302 immigrants who were born in France. Now, another thing I want to just define is direct political action, what I mean and why I look at that. So this is my dependent variable of interest in this paper. And I use a question in the European Social Survey that asks whether respondents have engaged in the following activities in the last year: signing a petition, demonstrating, and boycotting products. And so these commonly are quite highly related to each other. If you've done one, you're much more likely to do another. Some people call it unconventional participation, or I prefer the term direct action here. And so these are the kind of types that we're looking at. Now, I focus on these types of participation for 3 reasons. First, as you might No, of course, many immigrants don't have the right to vote, which also sometimes might stop them from participating in kind of more electoral related or party politics. So it's a good kind of alternative way to look at participation. Second, levels of direct action, interestingly, vary quite a bit across national contexts. So if you are interested in kind of explaining, like looking at different contexts of origin or destination, we see quite a lot of fluctuation in aggregate rates of direct political action between countries, which kind of gives us some purchase on trying to explain these variations. And third, because forms of participation, though, at the same time, are actually related, particularly so for immigrants. And so this is and I'll point to the relevant information here on this slide in a moment. This is a table from an older paper of mine published in 2012. And what I want to show here is how participation relates, and particularly so for immigrants. So what you see here, for instance, is that 22 to 30%, so we're looking at here, depending on the type of the background of immigrants who did not vote. So this group here, I'm looking at only citizens who are allowed to vote, but those who did not vote, only 22 to 30% of those participated in any other form of political participation. So any other form, whether that's contacting politicians, signing petitions, you name it. However, if they did vote it, you see these percentages jump to 57% and 41%. And that jump is much stronger if you see the percent increase for immigrants than it is for non-immigrants, meaning that for immigrants in particular, participation begets participation. There's that relationship. Likewise, if we look here at these are unconventional versus conventional forms of participation. So conventional, we're talking about contacting politicians, donating money, working for parties. So here we see that only 15 to 25% of immigrants who did not participate in conventional participation participated in a form of direct political action, whereas it jumps to 60% of immigrants who did participate in a form of conventional participation. So again, that relationship for immigrants in particular is quite strong. We see overall lower rates of immigrant political participation, but if they do so, they're more likely to do so across the board. So knowing something about direct political action and kind of what explains that, I think we can learn from that, also thinking through other forms of participation. So briefly, and consistent with prior research, this is just a slide that shows you purely the rates of political action compared to immigrants compared to non-immigrants, or those who were born in the country versus not. The main takeaway here is that you can see that in nearly every country, there's a few exceptions, the green bar, those not born in the country, is lower than the red bar, right? And so this should not be a surprise. I think most of us know this, but just to confirm that, I find that too. However, if we look at the percentage of immigrants in each country that has participated in a form of direct political action, again, whether that's signing a petition, demonstrating, or boycotting, we can see these rates vary substantially depending on the country they live in. For instance, we can see very high rates of participation in several of the Nordic countries, like here at the bottom, right, up to like 40%, even like 53% in Iceland. And as well as in France, and very low rates of participation by immigrants in these forums in countries such as Greece, Portugal, Bulgaria, and Russia. But even this masks a little bit the fact that there's also substantial variation within countries of residence, depending on where immigrants come from. So for instance, here, if you look at Belgium, so I highlighted the bar for you, immigrants born in France participate at a rate of 54% in direct forms of political action when living in Belgium, whereas immigrants originally from Morocco who live in the same country, Belgium, only participate at a rate of 19%. Likewise, if we look at Ireland, immigrants from Nigeria have rates of 23%, whereas immigrants from Poland only participate at a rate of 8%. So there's that substantial variation within. So there's also, continuing on to make my case for all this beautiful variation that we have to explain. So there's also a lot of variation in the extent to which immigrants have engaged in direct action, depending on the country where they originate from. So for instance, if you look at those who migrated from, so this is where they're born in, Countries like here at the bottom again, Germany, France, Great Britain, across the board, they have quite high probabilities to have engaged in direct action, whereas at the top of the figure here, immigrants from Albania, Brazil, Georgia have quite low rates of participation. Now, I'm sure that I'm talking to academics, so I'm sure that you've all already kind of thought of like, oh, well, there's some obvious explanations for these variations, right? We can probably think of, and I'm sure you've already, if you're anything, well, like an academic, you probably have already made your list. But there's also, again, that kind of difference rates. So I showed you the differential rate within countries of residence, but likewise, you see these differential rates depending where migrants come from. So we already looked at Moroccans in Belgium that participated at a rate of 19%. Moroccans in Spain also participated at a rate of 19%. But if you look at the Moroccan community in France, we see rates of direct action of 45%. So again, that really quite interesting, in my view, variation of that combination of where you come from and where you end up. And so an explanation that's one-sided, that's just focused on origin or just on destination, doesn't really seem to cover it. So let's go to explanations then. So this is a big model. It's pretty easily summarized. Many of you might know it. It's something I always give my students. It's the common model to explain participation by Verba, Schlossman, and Brady, their civic voluntarism model, where in a nutshell, they're predicting rates of direct action, or in their case, just participation broadly. I've adapted it somewhat with what they call participatory factors of whether you have resources to engage, and by that they mean, do you have the time, do you have money, do you have the skills, do you have the language skills, for instance. Levels of engagement, so interest in politics, trust in politics, also things like group identity that we know mobilizes, and whether you have the opportunities to be recruited, whether you have networks that might ask you to participate and get you involved. And I would, as part of this, also say, are you legally allowed to participate, of course. And they kind of feed this back to your institutional and social involvements, and these are the common characteristics that we often put in our participatory models. And that goes back to your socialization at home, in school, society, like whether you talked about politics, for instance, at home and things like that. And they tie that back to their initial characteristics. So this is a fairly common model that's used generally across the board. Now we can think of extending this model then by including different contexts, because Verba, Schlossman, and Brady just looked at the American context and took that for granted. So if you add the context of origin into the model and think about how long you spent there, we can kind of think how that impacts these differential things. And mainly, you can think about how context of origin impacts your socialization, right? Depending on the different kind of economic climate, the different kind of political culture, the rights that were present in the country you grew up in, whether there was conflict like war or things like opportunities. And these also to some extent filter through to your institutional and social involvement and your participatory factors, for instance, whether you have language skills. Now, all this, of course, depends on how old you were when you left and how long you've been in that kind of new context. Likewise, we have this context of residence. And there you can think of that relationship between residence and initial characteristic. For instance, something like whether the ethnicity in the context where you end up matches the ethnicity of the kind of context where you grew up in, right? And whether you, in that sense, are accepted. So hence that double-sided arrow. And again, factors like economy, political culture, rights, acceptance by majority populations, and the presence of co-ethnic communities are things that ultimately dictate, again, socialization, institutional involvements, and participatory factors. Again, depending on how old you were when you migrated. Okay, so the question then is, thinking through this, is which of these groups of factors together explain this variation that I've been just showing you in these graphs in rates of direct political action across immigrants. And so what I did, now we get to the modeling, is I ran a series of Bayesian cross-classified multi-level logistic models, which predict an individual immigrant's participation in one form of direct action. And in that model, I included both factors that differ between individuals, as well as factors that differ depending on the country and or context of origin and the country of context of destination. So a lot of immigrants, over 10,000. I'll come back to what I mean by context of origin and context of destination, because those are more than just the countries. And for those of you who want to know more about the model, I ran 4 Markov chains with 1,000 iterations each, which gives me sampling sizes of 4,000 estimates per parameter. Bayesian analysis is a little bit different, but most of the results we can interpret similarly. So happy to answer questions after that. So in these models, direct political action is a function of an overall intercept. You have individual level explanatory variables, context level explanatory variables, and then what I'm particularly interested in, the residual error term for context of destination and context of origin. Now, comparing these variance terms across models in which we include different sets of variables, we can see how much of the variance we can explain depending on where the kind of combined context of destinations, if people share that, and the combined context of residence. So it kind of gives us a bit of a sense of what explains the kind of similarities between different groups based on their origin and their destination. Okay, so this is an overview of the data setup. So it's a cross-classified model. So what that means is that we have immigrants, and so just given by numbers here, so our respondents in the data, and those are the unit level at level 1. And these immigrants can belong to both a context of residence, for instance, at the bottom here, you see the Netherlands in 2011, which is determined by when and where they were interviewed, right? The country they live in, and the year they were interviewed. And this is where I get to these contexts of residence. So I don't just look at the country, I also accept that things like the economy, for instance, or even the immigrant rights can change over time. And so I take that into account too. And likewise, at another level 2 is the context of origin. So immigrants also have a context of origin. And there, for instance, you can see the context, for instance, an immigrant might have moved from Germany somewhere in the period of 1998 to 2002. These are periods of 5 to 10 years, which is a function of the way the question was asked in the European Social Survey, which is more in blocks of periods, like the periods you moved. So I calculated these kind of joint periods in which I know when people moved and said that was the kind of the context of origin when you left. And then any measure, I kind of average over these periods. Which was a lot of work, but I won't get into that. So what I first did, we have common predictors of political action. So these are measures of resources, engagement, and opportunities, as I said, just from the model. So these are pretty familiar, probably types of variables: gender, years of education, occupational status, unemployment, some social measures of whether you meet socially, union membership, so kind of voluntary organizations, and then political interest and trust. I also include some immigrant-specific measures, whether you have citizenship or not, whether you speak the official language at home, whether you consider yourself to be part of an ethnic minority, and whether you consider yourself to be a group that is discriminated on the basis of nationality, race, religion, etc. And then I have these measures for time, essentially. So how old you are and how many years since you have moved. And then I include the ESS rounds as a control. Okay, so let's get to some results. So let me focus your attention first on these. So these are, because it's a Bayesian analysis, these are the posterior distributions. It's the median of the sampling. So you get your 4,000 estimates of the parameter, and you take the median of that estimate, and then you can calculate these credible intervals. So I show here the 50% to 95% credible intervals. For instance, if we look at social meetings here, we can be 95% confident that the true value of the parameter is not 1. We're looking at odd ratios, and 1 means that there's no relationship, right? So the main takeaways here, if we start from the bottom, is that across the board, we have differences in resources that matter. So for instance, your level of education, there's years of education, whether you have post-secondary education, your employment levels, or technicians, professionals are more likely to participate. Time, so if you're in education, we see people who are still in education more likely to participate. So these are things that we would expect, we generally know from participation literature. Likewise, If we look at political trust and interest, this also confirms what we know when it comes to direct political action. So trust has a kind of differential effect if you look at these kind of alternative ways of participating. Interest, clearly an important predictor. Then looking at the kind of minorities, so we do see that members of who consider themselves discriminated against, it seems to be a mobilizing impact in terms of participating, and speaking the language clearly also matters, that kind of resource. And then finally, we have these years since move and age. So here we see that the longer an individual has lived in their new country, the more likely they are to participate, as we would expect. But this at the same time that we see that younger people are more likely to engage in these forms of direct political action. Again, we know that, but it's interesting how these things work simultaneously. So for instance, if we look at the years since move, one way to interpret this with odds ratios is that the odds ratio is 1.04. So there's a 4% increase in the odds to participate in direct political action with every year that you've lived in your new country. Okay, so this is what I'm interested in these variance components. So first, what I did is run an empty model, which has no variables in there, just to get a sense of what the variance is. And there you can see the proportion of total variance attributed to context of origin, and the proportion of the total variance that is attributed to is due to between country of resident variance. So this is between country of origin variance and between country of residence variance. In total, if you add these two up, we're talking about 22% of all the variance in political action rates is due to either kind of differences between origin countries or differences between residence countries, which I think is a fairly high percentage depending on how you look at it. But if you think about how individuals, of course, are different, that there is this shared component, I think that's fairly substantial. Now, if we include in the individual model all these individual factors, what we see is that about half the variance between the different contexts of origin in direct political action, you can see that here, so this reduction, is explained by individual level factors, right? So that makes sense if you think about it, because it implies in a way, or makes sense, can make sense, that immigrants are not substantially different overall across country of residences in terms of their characteristics. Because if you look here at country of residence, we hardly see a reduction. So including individual characteristics does not explain much of the differential rates in political action that is due to differences across residence countries. So that's, again, probably signaling that immigrants are, as a whole, are not that different across the different residence countries. But they are in terms of where they come from, and that makes sense, right? If you come from a poorer country, you probably are less resourceful, you might have lower education, etc. So there we see a substantial amount of the variation explained. Okay, then if we look at the context level, I ran a second model that only included context level variables and a third model that included both context and individual. So for country of origin here, the variables are tapping into things like economic conditions, political culture, and rights and cultural similarities. So for instance, GDP, I have a measure of war, whether there was war during the period you left, political rights and liberties from the Freedom House, and I include a measure of average rate of political action. And this measure is something that I use a different survey for. So I used the World Value Study for that. And I calculated that across the whole period that I have that people might have left, because one, there's a fair amount of stability in these rates actually within countries. So there's a lot of variation across, but within countries, there's a fair amount of stability. And two, there was quite a bit of gaps and missing data. So I tried different measures, but compiling one measure for the whole period seemed to work quite well. Likewise, for destination, I do the same. I also have a GDP per capita. In the interview year, I have average rate of political participation for that same period. That captures really the kind of political climate where you come into and how people behave, where you land. I have a measure of migrants' rights. I won't show that. I can talk a bit more about that because there's a lot of issue with missing data. And then I include in italics foreign population and colonial time variables that were consistently not significant, and I chose to leave out. And I have a measure of a shared religious tradition between origin country and receiving country. And again, the ESS ran. So this is a plot that shows, this is based on the model that also includes individual level variables. And here I'm showing just the aggregate variables without the political action rates, because you can think that maybe what explains ultimate aggregate political action rates might be things like GDP or the political rights in a country. So I first run the model without these. And here we can see, for instance, that the odds of an immigrant participating in a form of direct political action decrease by 24% if they're from contexts that are partly free, and by 32% if they're from contexts that are free compared to immigrants from contexts that are not free. And this actually goes against some of the prior literature. And I have to say, this is something I need to look into a little bit more, why that is the case exactly. But it's an interesting finding. But as I said, I still need to look into that a bit more. Now, if we do include in these models the political action from the destination and political action of origin, some of the other variables become insignificant. Might make sense if you think about what predicts these aggregate rates. And what we can see is, for instance, the political action in the destination country. So here, we can see that it has an odds of 1.03, which means that with every percentage point increase in the rate of direct political action in the country of destination, the odds of an immigrant participating in direct political action increases by 3%. So with every 1% increase in their destination, the odds go up by 3%. Likewise, if we look at origin, we can say that with every 1% point increase in the rate of direct political action in the country of origin, the odds of an immigrant participating in direct political action also increase by 1%. So now this is not unsubstantial if we think about that countries from of origin, for instance, and even of destination can quite easily differ by 20 percentage points in direct political action rate. So this can add up, right? Okay, so how much do we explain? So if we include only aggregate level variables and no individual level variables in a model, we explain about half, again, 46% of the variance between different contexts of origin in direct political action. And as much as 58% here at the bottom of the variance between different contexts of residence. So, and that's particularly due to including these direct action rates from another survey, these kind of aggregate level of direct action rates in the models. That explains most of it. Finally, if we include both individual and context level variables, we explain about 69% of the variance, which I think is quite substantial between the different contexts of origin in direct political action, and about 47% of the variance between different contexts of residence. So what does that mean? So although I think things like the kind of the normal things that we know matter for political participation, like resources, are very important when it comes to explaining political participation, and also where you live before you move matters. I think there's evidence that migrants really do adapt substantially to the kind of political context in which they end up in. And that just kind of the way a population participates for whatever reason, and we can explain that again, probably by GDP levels or other things, but the way a local population participates, so that is something that immigrants do adapt to. And that this, you can also see this by the fact that those rates then go up over time. So that kind of adaptability, I think, is something that we should really not disregard. And that idea that we also really do see these substantial differences across countries of origin and destination, just the role of the context. Okay, I'll go very quickly over the second debate. So I think I have about 5 more minutes or so. So something like that. Okay, so my second debate, and I'll be short, is about whether we first need to get people engaged in politics, so interested and knowledgeable about their country of residence in general and its politics specifically, before they are ready and willing to get political active. So we often assume, and literature often assumes, that engagement kind of precedes participation and or should precede the right to participate. So we see this, for instance, in how we construct models with outcomes of political participation, which I just showed you, right, where we have interest and trust predicting participation, very common. But it is also a common assumption in policy debates, for instance, in debates about extending voting rights to immigrants. Like they need to have some sort of level of interest and knowledge before we allow them the right to vote. But increasingly, we see this research that suggests that participation might actually lead to engagement, and that participation also breeds participation, as I argued before, and that it can increase feelings of belonging to the country of residence, the new country. So examples here of that literature come from particularly the Get Out to Vote literature that has shown kind of the downstream benefits of being mobilized to vote and the impact that has on things like interest and voting again. And belonging to a community, and generally kind of broader political engagement. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg question, obviously, as many of our questions in political science. But I think it's important, particularly, again, as I said, when it comes to actually real life debates about extending voting rights to immigrants. Like maybe we should be extending voting rights, and that would actually make them feel more included and increase their participation. So one small, and as I said, I gave it already away, failed pilot study I did was taking advantage of the extension of voting rights. And this is work with Victoria Schinman, Stephanie Johnson, and Mark Pickup. We took advantage of the extension of voting rights to first-time non-citizens in school board election in San Francisco. And this was, as far as we know, the first time non-citizens were actually allowed to vote in the US. There were similar places where they're kind of working on this, but this is the first time it was allowed. And we quickly gathered up all our stuff and kind of ran this pilot study to see whether we could entice people to vote, giving information and even helping with registers if so asked, and to see whether that would impact voting rates. And then ultimately we had a pre and post survey where we asked about sense of belonging, about attitudes towards politics locally and nationally, as well as trust and interest in politics. So the setup was brilliant and I would love to do it again. But part of the problem turned into what we did is we did an extensive flyering campaign. We really hit the streets. We flyered extensively at different places. So also went a bit last minute through some schools, trying to reach parents, because of course it was just open to parents since it's school board. Did that on multiple weekends in the 3 weeks leading up to the election. And we had based ourselves in the library where we did an in-person randomized treatment where we either kind of talked to people, gave them the guide to registration, talked it through, had that survey, or where we actually pointed out the resources of the library for the children and kind of talked about the options that there were as a control condition. Now, why I say that it was failed, it's partly our fault and partly not. I would say not because in the whole city of San Francisco, 49 people additional non-citizens voted. So that's the whole city. So it was a big flop generally. We managed to reach out to 20 people. And 14 returned our seminar. So these are 20 people in total, not all who got the voting message, not all who voted. And so we didn't get many results. And one thing at the time, because it was a very, there was a big fear of ICE. And so there were some complications around that where people were very, very afraid as non-citizens to come forward. So we also had some problem with recruiting and finding non-citizens, but there also we noticed in conversations that there was a real hesitancy and concern what it might mean if they voted or what they would be put on record and how that could be used by the government. And so that we spent a lot of time explaining their rights and how they could be protected, but ultimately it's something we realized we underestimated the extent of. So, but I'd like to repeat something of this. So take home, I think generally the importance of the bigger picture I want to emphasize. Sometimes I think it's really useful to do very broad studies, and sometimes it's really useful to look at small causal mechanisms. But I think the bigger picture really stresses when we're having talks about immigrant integration and what matters more is that the wider context really matter, and that countries just even are so differential in terms of their own rates of participation. And it's not always what governments do for immigrants particularly, but I think it's also a lot to do with just the kind of the context, the types of societies people end up in. And I think we sometimes underplay that. And then the fact that I think participation begets participation. And I think we see this clear relationships between people participating. And so taking advantage of that and increasing engagement through such mechanisms, I think are very important. So my future work is hopefully going to look at partisanships in voting. I have a grant to do so. I was hoping to get further, but we all know COVID So it's been a bit of a setback. So I'm looking at how partisanship and voting across borders, whether people participated, how they felt about parties, and how that translates into, in particular, Canadian context. And one specific interest of mine is looking at the role of social connections. I've written quite a bit on it, like more broadly, not just with regards to immigrants, but how our small intimate networks kind of mobilize us. And I think that's particularly important when it comes to immigrants' participation. I will leave it at that. Sorry if I went a little long, but I was so excited to share this with you. So thank you.
So that's great. So what we're going to do now is we'll turn to the question and answer period. I will take your questions if you can raise your hand using the raise hand function if you know how. If you wave at me, I will try to notice you, but the raise hand function is a bit more reliable. So I have a question from Ruth.
Yeah, thanks, Eline, for the presentation, for the talk. It's really, really great to see what you've been working on. I'll focus on the first part, not on the failed experiment, which I think in general it's entirely plausible, the story that you're telling and the results that you've got. One thing I'm wondering about though is the sort of ultimately what has most weight. Is it mostly about socialization, or is it mostly about the adaptability? And in the end, which matters most? And I was wondering if you looked at all at interactions between the time that someone has been somewhere, or the time that they spend in their country of origin, and the impact of context. So some sort of, I'm guessing, interaction between how long you've been in the country and the impact of the context level factors of your country of residence, or the time that you spend, say, since you've turned, I don't know, 18 or so in your country of origin. So how much time have you really had to socialize entirely in your country of origin? How much time have you really had to socialize entirely in your country of residence? And does that affect the effects, I guess?
Thank you. Yeah, great questions. So I would say that I think socialization matters in the sense of the type of person and resources you have. So I think the big thing there is, like, if you come from a particular context, you're less likely to have a certain level of education maybe, or to be able to get employment, or to have language skills. And so I think that's where these individual things matter. And so that's really important. But when it comes to kind of the environment in which you grow up more broadly, in terms of like experience of political cultures or ways of participating, I think there we actually see a lot of adaptability. And I think I've had this back and forth about including aggregate political participation rates, because some people say, well, that's nothing, it is kind of the same thing, you're explaining participation with participation. But I think it actually shows you how just kind of this rate of participation of what's going on in a particular country actually really just matters for what people do. And how we explain that rate is by things, but I mean, it might be things like, think of the Black Lives Matter movement, like, are there events happening? And if there's events happening, there's opportunities for participation, which affects equally immigrants as they do the majority. So I mean, generally would stress the importance of kind of adaptability. And I think that's really, and still, although I mean, there's been some good work, but I still not very highlighted aspect, I think. And I think you really see that if you compare multiple countries of residence. And most studies really focus on groups of origin and in one or two countries of residence, but you don't see a lot of studies that kind of look at a lot of countries of residence. When it comes to, yes, interactions and time spent, interaction effect is something that I definitely still need to get at. It's a little bit of a challenge with running some of the models. They're not impossible, but they're a bit comprehensive and they take a while. So that's one thing where I just haven't quite gotten to. When it comes to socialization time, I have done models in the past where instead of time spent in a country, I look at how long you've been in your country of origin. You get effects which you would expect, like the earlier you left, the more likely you are to participate in your new country. So I can't include it all in the model. That's just not possible, because of course you kind of get this linearity. So I can't include both age, how long you've been in the country, and when you and how long you've stayed in your former country, because that just doesn't. So I had to make a choice. Thank you. That answered your question.
Well, I put myself on the list. So if anybody else has any questions, just use the chat or raise your hand. My question was about the adaptability. And I'm wondering what your research tells us about the socialization literature more generally, which tends to focus on the first half of that, the non-adaptability over the life course rather than the adaptability. And you probably don't have an answer to this, but I wanted to pose it anyways. Do you think that immigrants are particularly adaptable? And so if in any situation, in any country, we have some people who tend to be more exposed to new experiences and thus to have new socialization experiences. I assume immigrants are pretty, are not risk averse. They're particularly adaptable individuals because they're exposing themselves to new experiences. And so could it be that the adaptability of immigrants tells us something about a particular type of socialization related to predispositions towards openness to new experiences, all kinds of personality characteristics that might be disproportionately found among people who choose to immigrate?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, the average immigrant might not be the average person, right? Quite likely. And so there might be something to that. I think so. Yes, is the short answer to that last part. I think that might be key. But I think more important when it comes to what you started off with, the socialization literature, I think socialization matters, but I think what sometimes it is, I think the reinforcement of socialization is really important. And I'm really struck, and I'm an immigrant myself, and I've seen the same with me, and I've seen the same when I did my my degree in England. And I had a conversation with a taxi driver in San Francisco who reaffirmed the following idea, is that I think the way we get involved with politics and talk about politics is often a social thing. And so if you're socialized from an early age to talk about politics, and that's an interesting thing, and then you're in networks in a particular country where you do so, that just gets reinforced over time. What happens when people move is they initially have ties back home, and so they're still talking about the politics back home. And at some point there's a shift where, more of their friends or their networks are in a country where they move to, and the social chat about politics and it becomes more of interest here. And so, the taxi driver I spoke to had been, I think, in the US for 10 years. And he says, and he literally said that, I'm now voting because I've now finally kind of given up on my home country politics. And now I feel that I know enough here and I'm ready. And this is what we talk about. And now I'm, and it's, to some extent, it's a trade-off. I don't think it's also always true. But I think the social aspect of what socialization, how that gets reinforced, our ideas, our communication, our discussion, our behaviors, I think is important. And that's where you get that break with immigrants that you don't necessarily get with people who stay put.
Andre, and then Beatland.
Thanks a lot. I have a question about something you haven't raised in the paper, but I guess related. I would like to know whether you know of any study that looked at this, because I assume that what's very important in the country of new country of residence is the actions made by groups who try to accommodate immigration. Some of these groups are very politicized, others not. So do you know of any study, I guess, that looks at the impact of groups who try to make it easy for immigrants to socialize and how politicized they are?
So by groups, do you mean like NGOs that try to aid immigration? Yeah.
Yes, groups and churches as well, I guess, I suppose.
I definitely know that there is research, and from the Netherlands, for instance, also older research about kind of Jean Tilly from the Netherlands has done work way back in 2004 and stuff about kind of connections in voluntary organizations, both what he called like with organizations that are non-immigrant as well as within, so the kind of cross-cutting and showing that, yes, this kind of embeddedness, more of involvement with organizations helps. It's not quite the same as kind of the context that you're talking about, I think, which is more if you have a context of help. There's some studies I know that look more at that kind of climate, that versus the official laws and help and aid from the government versus the kind of the overall national kind of context of NGOs that reach out. So there's some institutional studies. I'm wondering if Antje Ellerman at UBC has looked at that particular, but there's some kind of the more organizational laws and informal help that there is. So there's some of that. So one way I try to get indirectly at that, which admittedly is a very bad measure, is just looking at the percentage of foreign population, but that touches more on the co-ethnic communities, because that's a somewhat different argument from what you're saying. But the role of resources within a community. And then, of course, I do know there's some experimental literature, and I'm actually talking to some groups too about that work with immigrants. And so I've talked very early stages, but discussions about whether you can kind of look at, and I know they do a lot of outreach. And so that seems to, I think that at a local level, we know that matters. Like in Toronto, I know there's been some work on these kind of groups reaching out and mobilizing immigrants. So from the Get Out to Vote literature, we kind of see that that matters too. Is that a bit of an answer?
Eline is next, and then Isabella.
Actually, sorry about that. My question actually follows Andre's question. So I was actually interested in the co-ethnic mobilization. And I think it doesn't really work when you study this at the country level, because, I mean, people really need to be locally together, but there could also be national organizations that hold nationals of a certain background together. So there might be a point in studying this at the national level, but I'm saying, but you could also, I guess, link it to the local level data, which would be a lot of work, where people are from and whether they do have co-ethnics in their neighborhood. But I think even the example of Moroccans that you show, that is so different in these different contexts, I think, might be explained by such variables, whether there is a strong network, ethnic network there that they can tap into or not, and how that relates to their mobilization.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. One thing I was popping in my mind is an alternative measure might be kind of residential concentration, at least. And you might be able to kind of within a country, like whether groups are very kind of concentrated or not in certain areas. And if they are, whether that helps or hinders. The co-ethnic mobilization argument, I think as you clearly know, is a well-established argument in the literature, especially like ethnic capital. That term is, I'm sure you know that. And so I think there's something to that. And I know the older studies have looked at that important role, which is why I try to include this measure of foreign population, but it's just not nuanced enough, and it's not doing anything. But it also ties into my interest more, what I spoke to at last of these kind of the social connections, because for me, there's the organizational things, which I do find interesting, but I'm personally particularly interested in more the kind of the harder to get at little social networks and connections and how that increases participation. Say, for instance, if your little things like if your partner got citizenship before you, and how does that mobilize, and these sorts of connections are actually really interested in looking into a bit more deeply.
Okay, so so the partner, I mean, that is a survey questionnaire issue, but I think if you had local linkage data, geographic data, then you could link it at least to the percentage of co-ethnics in their neighborhood or in their census tract, maybe. Yeah. And that would give you potentially, who do you run into kind of measure.
Yeah, I think for Canada, this might certainly be, if I do study in Canada, I'm wondering what the European I know the European Social Survey data has like aggregate data already included in it. So there's things you can draw on. So I can have a look at, I worry that the areas wouldn't be small enough, because I think, but it might be a first start. But the other measures I've used in the past, which kind of maybe comes back to Andre's point too, is I know there's measures out there. There's this wonderful series of books about organizations in all countries. And so you could just look like at measures of organizations and maybe wonder if they split up by types of organizations. So that's less to your point, but more to Andre's point. But I was thinking of kind of different measures. But yeah, it is an important, I should go back to that. I think that's the main point, to kind of co-ethnicity, because I think it is an important argument there in the literature that I should try to test a bit better than I do currently. So thank you for that. I'm just thinking still as I finish.
Isabella?
Hi, Lena. Really great to see you again.
Good to see you, Bella.
Question. So I was wondering about the direct action that you were counting, the petition and protest participation. But as an immigrant to the US myself, I've seen a lot of, for example, there are Polish Americans who would be very active in these direct action activities in their own little Polish American circle, but they don't really do any of those activities in the mainstream American circle. So I'm wondering if, and I've seen this type of behavior across many different immigrant communities. So I'm wondering if this would have any impact on the general research. Would it still count as political participation in the new destination country, because they are just really still in their tight bubble? Would it necessarily not count?
It's a really good question. And so I tend to take the position that action is action, and that when you can start kind of saying on what topic it is. For instance, when you look at particularly demonstrations, it's easier, because I'll come back to your point about petition, because I don't think I can so easily cop out there. But when it comes to demonstrations, I think, you sometimes see, for instance, Chinese minorities here or immigrants protesting the Chinese government. I would still say that's in part still also a message for the people here. And so I would still count that also as just participation in your country of residence. I think that these sort of forms of notwithstanding the topic, you're still participating in your country of residence, and that resonates. And that is often these forms, especially demonstrating, is meant to change public opinion, right? And that in part is also the public opinion of fellow immigrants here or the government here. When it comes to petitions, that it's not so easily said, because if it is really just targeted in an electronic petition that is just targeted, say it's in Polish and it's just targeted at, if it's just part of the Polish expat community, that's a bit harder. And it also relates to the same thing of like voting back in your country of origin. And I think that's maybe a bit different. And I mean, the short is I can't distinguish that here, obviously. But there is some distinction to be made, I think, at the target of participation, but I wouldn't be too strict in that. There are certain things that are definitely different. But when it comes, as I said, to say demonstrating, because it's here, I would say that is probably always, I would always count as in the country of residence. But petition signing or voting back home has probably a slightly different dynamic to it when you're explaining participation. So, yeah. Good point.
Thank you.
Thomas, and then Valerian.
Well, thanks for that presentation. I wonder, I mean, I know you can't probably tell this from the ESS data, but I do wonder to what extent it would matter what kind of protests we're thinking of here, right? What kind of direct action people are involved in, because that also then pertains to the theoretical mechanism of how people get roped in, right? And your model seems very sort of generic, in a way, very non-immigrant specific, right? This is sort of verba standard political science stuff that is really not made or doesn't really, not adapted to potentially the particular situation of immigrants. So for example, to what extent do immigrants get mobilized around specific immigrant causes, right? I mean, if you think about the massive protests you had among undocumented immigrants in California in 2006, for example, right? That would be a huge blip in your data, right? If you had caught these in a survey, right? And there were very specific mechanisms how people got roped into participating in these protests. It had to do with organizations, with unions, with local organizations. And so I wonder to what extent these kinds of things are really what's going on here, specific causes, specific mechanisms of recruitment, rather than this sort of maybe rather generic model that's sort of at the base here.
Yeah, thanks for that. So yes and no, I would say. So my yes is in the sense that Obviously, there's causes that are particular, and Bella highlighted a few of those also that relate to, say, the home country, or things that particular, as you say, the particular status and protests around that. So there definitely are causes. Whether that relates to different dynamics, I think they would, but I'm not sure. Like in my model, as I started, like this is as broad a study as it can get, and it's always open to critique, as in I'm missing what the participation is exactly about. I mean, there's a lot I'm missing, and hence it's kind of a first kind of setup in which then I want to look more closely with either experimentals or also planning some qualitative work at more what's going on the ground, right? I think you kind of need to do both a bit, but the bigger picture always misses the details. But what I would say is that, so for instance, I think when it comes to, there are different maybe recruitment ways, but if you look at a measure of social meetings in the European Social Survey, it doesn't ask who you're meeting with. So yes, there's a specific dynamic, but it's still, I think something like that, having a social network is important for everyone. And so these kind of like, we still know that people are being mobilized through social networks and connections. Now, those connections might be different, but if you don't have connections, you're not going to be mobilized. So I think a lot of these things, although it's a generic model, but I think they do apply to immigrants. And sometimes I actually would go the other way and sometimes think that the literature that studies immigrants, particularly in Europe, a lot of the literature, sometimes treats them like a whole different species of people. And I find that very odd. And I think like there's a lot of things that explain, even though the context changes or maybe the particular cause changes, I think a lot of the things that enable or work against participation are actually can be fairly similar. I mean, of course, language, for instance, is an issue, but people who speak badly their own mother tongue also struggle with participation. So I think there are parallels. It's just that certain factors are more present among immigrants.
Can I follow up on this quickly? I think there the ESS is a bit problematic though as a data set, right? Because it systematically does not contain those people who don't speak the language, because the interviews are not done in other languages. So I think that's a real, I mean, I've worked with this data myself and it's, you're missing those who don't speak the language.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I didn't have a chance to speak more about representativeness of the data. I did do some checks in terms of comparing like percentages of immigrants in countries to official statistics. And there, the ESS is actually not as bad as one might expect, like in terms of percentages of groupings. But what you're clearly missing, I mean, obviously, the immigrants in the ESS are relatively high resourceful immigrants. Like that's, yeah, I would not deny that. That is definitely the case.
We'll hand it over to Valeriane for, I think, the last question.
Yeah. Hello, Eline. It's nice to see you. It would have been nicer to have you in Montreal, but
yes.
Yeah, another time, hopefully. I had a few questions for you. I was wondering if in your analysis you would be able to talk about the different types of immigrants, those who really, like, for example, economic immigrants, or those who seek out better opportunities, and those who are kind of forced into immigration. I don't know, the adaptability would change in terms of rate or in terms of speed, or the extent of the adaptability or not. And then I was wondering, so you talked a bit about connections you had with the people in Toronto. So I was wondering if there would be a chance you'd be doing an experiment in Canada, and so that we have finally more experiments in Canada and not just in the US. So just to hear about your next projects maybe. And also I was wondering about that, you were talking about the role of social connections, and I know you've worked on that. So I was wondering, you mentioned partnership. So would it be, again, a study like you've done before, more in the household or in a broader social context? So kind of like which types of social connections and how you would study them, I guess, experimentally. So I'm curious about that, your next steps.
Wow. Okay, I'll try to keep it brief, but I'd love to talk to you more, obviously, at some point, and good to see you. The reasons for moving, cop out, not included in European Social Survey, but I do think, again, one of these kind of more smaller mechanisms I think it is important to look at. And I'm wondering if there's something about my finding about the Freedom House that might relate to the type of immigrants that are coming, or conflict zones, that we actually see surprisingly higher rates of participation, and you kind of wonder if it has something to do with that. Experiments in the future, I am planning, but as you know, experiments can have a long lead up time until they're not, and suddenly have to be in the field tomorrow. So there's always this kind of, so I have some feelers out with an organization in Vancouver and in Toronto for maybe, but this is all very tentative, so I won't say too much about that because, as you know, it might not go anywhere. But these are organizations that work with immigrants. And so one of the ideas would be to do some experiment that looks at the connections even that are made within, say, language classes among, so not just partners, but things like that. But that's all very tentative. So we'll see whether and how that materializes. So, but yeah, another part of it is more surveys and survey experiments kind of thing. But that's more about the partisanship and voting ideas. And that would take more the form of a survey and potentially experiment within a survey.
So I'd like to thank everyone for coming out this afternoon. I think we learned a lot and hopefully gave you some interesting ideas for future research as well. Our next talk and last talk in the CSDC speaker series is next week, same time, same place. We have all the information is in the chat, as I said. I'm just going to pull back up so I get all the information correct. Is Patricia Posey, Race and Indebted Access, How the Fringe Economy Shapes Political Inclusion. With that, we also have a small token of our appreciation for Eline, and it is CSDC tradition to normally make you open something in front of all of us, which is amusing for us, not always amusing for the speaker. But instead of doing that, because we can't be in person, Wim will show you what will be mailed to you if you provide a mailing address.
We send you a cup with the poster of your talk here. And
lovely.
I will email you to ask for your address.
Okay, I will send that. I'm excited. Thank you very much. That's very thoughtful. Personalized present. Thank you very much. And thank you all for all your excellent questions and for thought-provoking points. And for having me talk.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll be able to see you in Montreal in person at some point. My daughter's son. Thank you. All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.